Okay, so I'm about to replace the wheel bearings on my bike. It's a TRX850, but I have a YZF750 swing arm and rear wheel on it. So when you're replacing wheel bearings, the first thing you need to do is establish, obviously, do your bearings need to be replaced. Now it's pretty easy to test your rear wheel bearings or even your front wheel bearings. Easier certainly than checking your swing arm bearings. I'll show you my rear wheel because my rear wheel bearings are in need of replacement. My rear disc is also in need of replacement, as you can probably see from this picture. Anyway, to check if your rear wheel bearings are in need of replacement, what you need to do is jack the rear wheel off the ground. I've just used a paddock stand, as you can see here, and just take the wheel and try and move it basically from side to side. Now you can hear in that wheel there's a bit of a knock. Basically tells me there's a bit of a play in the bearings, and therefore they need to be replaced. So first thing you need to do is ascertain what bearings you need to buy to replace your bearings. You can probably find your bearing numbers on the internet. If you can't, just take your wheel off and you'll see, first off you'll see a bearing seal there. So you can see the seal here. So that seal is useful because it's got a number on it that tells me the size of the bearing seal I need to replace. And if I pull that seal out with a screwdriver, I'll show you how to do that shortly, you'll see the bearing number on the bearing itself. Obviously the same applies on the other side. In this case you've got a sprocket carrier with a sprocket carrier bearing and seal. Once you take the sprocket carrier off, you'll see the wheel bearing in there. Again, the size will be written on the wheel bearing. So I've bought my bearings this morning and my seals, and you can see I've bought the two wheel bearings here because I don't need to replace my my sprocket bearing, and two oil seals because it's always good to replace oil seals when you replace bearings. So you can see here on my oil seal it's got some numbers on it. In this case I have 35, 52 and 8. What that tells me is the inside diameter of this seal is 35 mm, the outside diameter is 52, and the width is 8 mm. Similarly, I've got my new bearing here, or one of my new bearings here, and again this has a number on it. A little bit tricky to see on this camera, but the number here is 60/28 or S. So what that tells me is it's a 60/28 is the bearing number, and ORS tells me it's a shielded bearing. So now I'm going to get on, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the rear wheel off the bike and drive the old bearings out. Okay, so as you can see here now, I've taken the rear wheel off my bike. Here it is on the ground. Now what we have on this wheel is, on this side we have our sprocket and sprocket carrier. On the sprocket carrier here you can see we have a bearing seal, and underneath that is a bearing. Now if I take this sprocket carrier out, it just lifts out. So if I take this sprocket carrier out, you can see there's the back of the bearing inside the sprocket carrier. Again, that has some numbers on it. Now I'm not replacing that bearing, but I am going to replace the oil seal on the other side because it's a little bit tired, and I'll show you that in a moment. Inside the wheel here we can see there's the first wheel bearing that's going to be replaced, and if I turn the wheel over I can see there's an oil seal here, and underneath that is a second bearing. Now I'm just going to remove this oil seal. Now in my case I'm going to replace this oil seal, so I don't need to be terribly careful when I'm removing it. But if you're not going to replace the oil seal, be careful when you take it out. Just make sure you use a nice flat screwdriver with a nice wide head on it to minimize the amount of damage you do to the oil seal when you pull it off. To take the oil seal off is pretty straightforward. As I say, I just take my flat screwdriver and I'll slide it underneath the oil seal and just lift it out. You can see there's the oil seal that's popped out. Now I'm going to replace that, so I don't need it. and there's the second bearing under there that's got to come out. So it's quite greasy or quite rusty and needs to be replaced. I'm just going to take this sprocket carrier over here, and I'll take my flat screwdriver. So as I said, I'm not actually going to replace the bearing in this sprocket carrier, it's quite good. But I have bought a replacement oil seal, so I'm going to replace that. First thing I do is take this existing oil seal out, and it's the same process as before. I just slide my screwdriver under it and just pull it out. Okay, so that's that oil seal out, and I don't need that anymore. I have a replacement one here to go in. So before I go in, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clean up this area, and I'm going to put some new grease in there, and then pop the new oil seal in. So I'll just clean that up now. Okay, so I'll just use a rag just to wipe away what's here. And just give it a bit of a clean. Now you can check this bearing while you have it out. Just basically spin it, and it should spin freely and there should be no noise. So this bearing's in nice good condition. I should say at this point, actually, when you're buying bearings, don't buy cheap bearings. It's a terrible waste of money. Good bearings aren't actually that expensive. You probably pay 30 Australian dollars for a good Japanese bearing. This bearing in here is a Nachi bearing. I don't know if you can see that. That's Japanese made. The bearing I'm putting in the wheel is a Koyo bearing. Again, it's a good quality bearing. About $30. There's cheaper bearings available, presumably out of China. Look, they're not terribly good. They're not as well made. Bearings have to be made within very fine tolerances. It's a reasonably expensive manufacturing process, so you can't expect them to be too cheap. So next thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to apply a nice new layer of grease. I'm going to put a little bit of grease around the edge of my new oil seal, and I'm just going to push that oil seal in. Okay, so here we are. I've just put some new grease on that. I'm just using a lithium grease. Taking my new oil seal here, and I've just put some grease on the inside of that. It's a bit messy on the outside, but I'll clean that up after, and just put a little bit of grease around the edge just to ease it in, make it easier to put in. So I just pop that over and just push it down with the palm of my hand. And you'll feel that seat in there. And that's that job done. That's the oil seal replaced in my sprocket carrier bearing. So what I'll do is I'll just wipe that with a cloth just to get rid of the excess grease, and I'll put that aside to go back in the bike.